Francesca Albanese, welcome to Wellington.
Allora, con Francesca Toto Ingua.
Ciao Ray.
And I'm really impressed by the warmth of this room made by all of you. I'm really touched by this full room, and I'm very humbled to be here in Whenua, a place that speaks to me very profoundly, especially as after Australia, after I have huge respect and love from Australian friends, so be gentle. But no, I learned so much in my 10 days and 35 meetings in Australia, especially something that I will never forget. I will never be anymore in a settler colonial country without acknowledging, first and foremost, the First Nations, the native people, and as you beautifully do here and also in Australia. And it's very powerful for me to do so, as I found myself blessed to be part of the story of these wonderful people, and I would say wonderful peoples, because I feel very strong when I talk and say that what I say, and when I speak of human rights, I speak both for the Palestinians and the Israelis, because both of them are trapped in a settler colonial regime. But of course, the level of responsibility, the level of suffering, the level of agency differs. And the Palestinians are the ones without right between the river and the sea. And this is what we have to solve together and help both the Palestinians and the Israelis to achieve. So I know, this trip has been planned for a long time. I was invited here, not here, in Australia, but to give a lecture, because this year is the 20th anniversary since the passing of Edward Said, a scholar, an immense intellect, which has given so much to all of us, not just the Palestinians. And I was really honored to be invited for such an event to deliver the Edward Said lecture, but I said, come on, I'm a very environmentalist deep down, so I'm not going to travel all the way there just to give a lecture. Let's make the killing of the trees that taking me there will imply worth it. And so, yes, this is how it became a full-on mission with meeting governments, civil society actors, slapping of the media. It was the highlight of my stay in Australia. I'm sorry, but they deserved it. And yeah, this is also what took me here. So just to make sure it's clear what I endured. I've been here for 2 days, and so, not even 2 days, no, 2 days, and this is why the 18 meetings and many interviews make more sense to you. But I would like this to be a chat rather than a monologue. So over to you, sister.
So I first of all, for a long time, because I grew up in England, I didn't even know how to say the word rapporteur. Like I was like, is it rapporteur, rapporteur? Like the English have a brilliant habit and history of butchering French words. So if you could just explain to us not only a little bit about the role, but what the mandate of that role is, how you came to be in that role, because for many of us that's like a very distant thing. It sounds very technical, so please do explain.
Okay, I'm not sure that I pronounced the word correctly, being an Italian native speaker. So, but anyway, it's rapporteur, And so what do I do? So first of all, there are about 50 of us, 50 special rapporteurs and independent experts appointed by the United Nations without pay, but to make our independence more visible. And so we are appointed on the basis of our competence, of our specific knowledge on a given topic or on a given country, with different mandates. So most mandates are concern human rights, but for example, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the prevention of torture, and there are a few mandates who are country-specific. Iran, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and the occupied Palestinian territory. I mean, this is frankly the only mandate. It's very sensitive because it's the only mandate that really doesn't naturally enjoy the favor of Western states. You can imagine why. So I knew what I was putting myself into when I applied for this position. And how did I go and, how did I find myself into this mess? Because for many Italians of my generation, the question of Palestine is a heartfelt issue, in the sense we grew up used to see the quest for Palestinian rights advocated for and represented by governments. It was a domestic issue, while also recognizing the rights of Israel, the state of Israel and the rights of Israelis. It was a beautiful golden era. Now it's gone, because we are back to ground zero. So there is a lot of misinformation, a lot of dehumanization. We will get there. But however, I was raised in a situation where, again, I grew up imbued with this sense of the other, both the Palestinians, but also as someone who comes from a country where people have been sent to die just because they were Jews. I've been educated, profoundly educated, to recognize the danger of dehumanization, which is, we often say, lawyers often say genocide is a process and not an act, and start with dehumanization. And God knows how much dehumanization Jewish people have endured in Europe. Not for decades, for centuries. And otherwise, what they endured during Nazi fascism wouldn't have been possible. But because of that, because people of my generation grew up educated to this, educated to recognize anti-Semitism, I do say, and these are not my words, but I do recognize the Jew in the other. The person who's a victim, the person who's discriminated against, the person who's dehumanized and vilified. And I will always stand with this person, regardless of the nationality, gender, religion, and I will always stand with the victim. So this is what I brought to the mandate as a human being. And then, of course, through my life, I've been engaged on the question of Palestine as a lawyer working for the UN, with the Office of the High Commissioner first, and then UNRWA. And after being in the occupied Palestinian territory for 3 years, working as a lawyer for UNRWA, I said, this is not where I want to be in life. And again, no regrets. Much love to UNRWA, who's in a terrible situation right now, together with the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. But at the same time, I didn't want to be part of it, because when I was in Palestine, there was something inside me that was deeply, physically uncomfortable. And back then, 13 years ago, I didn't have the word in my mind, but I kept on saying, I do not have the antibodies of the Palestinians, I cannot stand this, and it was apartheid. It was apartheid. And only when I heard the word applied to the occupied Palestinian territory, I realized what made me so uncomfortable. The system that collected everything, that kept everything together. The humiliation, the indignity, the discriminatory regimes, the military orders regulating every minute of Palestinian life. So I knew that after leaving Palestine didn't leave me. And then after a number of years, I started engaging on the question as a scholar. And after 5 years of study, research, archival digging, I produced a book Self-promotion, wonderful book. It's very, very boring, but it's very useful. It's Palestinian Refugees in International Law, which talks about everything that Palestinian refugees are from a legal, political, and humanitarian point of view. So dispelling some of the myths. And this is what I was doing. I was working with an NGO which had brought back the question of Palestine to the Middle East. Because with my friends in Jordan, I said, but why the question of Palestine needs to be discussed always in the West? I'm white, but a mistake, I believe. Because I said, yeah, it's true. And so we created this center, this global network on the question of Palestine, which is really rooted in the Middle East and attracts expertise from outside to discuss the question of Palestine in the Middle East. And this is what I was doing when the special rapporteur, the previous special rapporteur said, yeah, I heard you talking, and you look great, why don't you apply for the job? I mean, it took 1 year to let that thing sink in, and here we are. Special rapporteurs have a very easy task. They need to monitor and report international law violations in a given country. In my case, the occupied Palestinian territory, West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip.
Thank you, Francesca. So one of the other questions that I had was kind of like, why did you end up here? But I was just wondering, I mean, I think, you don't want to repeat the talk that you've given over and over again, and that's why we're doing this format. But I think that what has brought people to this room tonight is for many of the people, is a real hunger to make sense of the last month or so and what has just unfolded in front of us, to make sense of it in a context, but also to make sense of what has just happened. So I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit about, I guess, the moments after what happened on October 7th and what has unfolded since then in your view.
So I've said that the 7th of October has been a watershed horror moment that has thrown all of us into the sort of ground zero of humanity. And I mean it. And when I say all of us, it's all of us, the Palestinians, the Israelis, and all of us either watching or condoning. Because I heard someone saying, silence is violence. I agree. But there is a lot of violence that goes around the way stories are told or untold. And the Palestinians are often victims in this process. The 7th of October has seen, as many of you know, heinous acts committed by Hamas and possibly other armed groups emanating from the Gaza Strip against Israeli civilians. We still don't know how many of the victims, of the 1,200 people who were killed, of the thousands who were injured, of the 240 who were taken hostages are civilians. But for me, it doesn't really matter. These are all victims, and there are people longing for them, crying for them, when we think that there are babies as young as 9 months old. I mean, as a mother, I have the same kind of pain if I think of a Palestinian mother who's crying for her kids under the rubble, or dead in a plastic bag in a hospital, or a mother who doesn't know where her children are, probably in a tunnel, held by Hamas or somewhere else. It's very critical to understand that. I mean, we are at loss with a sense of lack of humanity here. I've condemned what Hamas has done as war crimes from the very first hours. And, but also I've been holding my breath because having observed, having studied the question of Palestine and Palestinian forced displacement, I knew that nothing good would come out of that. But I've never fathomed to be here 45 days on and see and say what I'm going to say. Because what the response or the reaction that Israel has had after the 7th of October has been completely out of control. I know that you have heard over and over Israel invoking the right of self-defense. And this is something that needs to be clearly spelled out and understood. Israel has the right to protect itself, to protect its territory and to protect its citizens. So it's not that it was to watch passively to what had happened. It had to respond, clearly so. But what Israel has done is to invoke the right of self-defense under the UN Charter, which is not the right to protect itself. It's the right to wage a war. It's the right to use military force, which under international law is only allowed against another state. And Israel has not claimed the threat coming from another state. And this is the other thing. There is consolidated international jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice that says that only a threat emanating from a state can trigger military response, an attack or a severe threat. But this is legalistic. What I would like you to understand, it's another consolidated principle, is that self-defense cannot be invoked, so a war cannot be waged against a population under occupation. And this is what the Palestinians are. Israel has made a lot of, has invested a lot, and there has been a lot of said and written regarding Gaza not being occupied, but Gaza is occupied, and I'm happy to elaborate upon it. But Gaza is occupied, and so the Palestinians inside Gaza. And not only they've been occupied, but they've been under an illegal blockade, which was already unlawful, which was already collective punishment, which was already a war crime before the 7th of October. People seem to have forgotten because they say, oh, but there is a collective punishment. There was already collective punishment, and there has been such a collective punishment unaddressed, also because of the international community. The international community's silence and inaction. Silence no, because they do condemn. They condemn and they condemn and they condemn a lot. But then that's it. This is how much you get when it comes to Israel and occupied Palestinian territory from the international community. It's getting really warm. But even if, let's admit, let's recognize for a second that Israel had the right to defend itself and wage a war against Gaza, which didn't happen, but let's imagine. There are basic principles in international law of distinction. So civilians cannot be targeted. And bombing a refugee camp where there are 400 residents, including hostages, because Israel had to kill one person, this is not respecting the principle of distinction. In fact, it can constitute a crime of extermination, because there is the intentional assumption that those 400 civilians can be killed or harmed. And then also there has been the tightening of the blockade. So while Israel was launching 6,000 bombs per week over this strip of land of 360 kilometers, where 2.2 million people are cramped, half of them children, 40% of the population in Gaza is not even 15. And what kind of distinction could 6,000 bombs per week make? There has been no respect for the principle of distinction, no respect for the principle of proportionality. Each military action needs to, not to create damage that is, that overcomes the military achievement. There was not even a military goal, because the goal has always been, let's eradicate Hamas, not necessarily Hamas military capability, because this could have been done through the United Nations, it's still been done elsewhere. But it was eradicating Hamas, and then the language has worsened. Flatten Hamas, flatten Gaza, erase Gaza from earth, wipe out Gaza. And then the level of dehumanization has increased and increased. Palestinians being called human animals, and then someone said, no, not even animals, because if you call them animals, you insulted the animals. And then babies associated with called terrorists. I mean, the discourse has become genocidal. We like it or not. And this discourse has worsened and worsened over time. to the point that it has been amplified by many in Israel. Artists, doctors, people in the media, letting alone always, more remote and marginated and minority of Israeli Jews who stand against this, but they are there. And they've been threatened themselves, have been risking their life themselves. And they still continue to do a honorable job, which is to document what's happening, not only in Gaza, where almost 12,000 people have been killed, 5,000 of whom are children, of whom we do not know nothing. We do not know anything, because they are numbers. And this is what the West absorbs, just numbers. And then, but while this was being done, bombs were pouring, no food, no medicine, no aid, no fuel, with people drinking seawater, with people cramped in 200-300 in Anwa schools, with one toilet per 300 people. The sewage system has collapsed, and skin disease are spreading. There is a risk of cholera. And someone, the advisor to the Israeli advisor to the Minister of Defense yesterday published an article on an Israeli newspaper which said this disease, the spreading of disease, will make victory closer. And it's horrific. It's horrific, and as this amplifies, you can see that what has been done reflects this intent, because half of the Gaza Strip has been completely empty. Not completely. 1.6 million people have been displaced to the south, while the south is still being bombed. There are 400 people left who cannot be reached by humanitarian corridors or anything, because Israel controls the division of, the line the demarcation line between the north and the south. And it's interesting because the soldiers are saying, and are on record, this is why I'm saying, like in other cases, they are telling the public, they are telling the world what they are doing. They're saying, we came here with instructions to destroy this place and settle. And this is why I was saying tonight, and I've said it 30 times before, if any of us has not registered what the Nakba was in 1947-49, and also the Naksa in 1967, because in 1947-49, 80% of the Palestinians from modern-day Israel were expelled and never allowed to return. And in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, 350,000 Palestinians were displaced and never allowed to return. And unlike, and this is something that an Israeli friend told me recently, she was traveling with us in Australia, and she said, we Jewish people have managed, above all the horror we have endured, to come to a closure with our past. It's still part of who we are as a nation, but still, this is recognized. We commemorate it. We have museums, we have our history told and told. The Palestinians have not been allowed to do so. Not only the Palestinians have not been allowed to come to a closure, because their history, their story, their Nakba, which is a crime in and of itself, has not been acknowledged, is even denied. And they have to explain over and over and over what the Nakba is. And this is why I say, if people in the West, because I think it's mainly my people, if people in the West have not realized what the Nakba is, there it is, televised under our watch. Destruction, forced displacement, and settlement. Because the Israelis are planting Israeli flags, the Israeli soldiers are planting Israeli flags everywhere in the northern Gaza Strip, while people are still rotting under the rubble, including thousands of kids. And while this is happening in the Gaza Strip, what's happening in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem? In 40 days, 200 Palestinians have been killed by soldiers and settlers. Ben-Gvir has been giving weapons and license to kill any Palestinians to Israeli armed settlers. And there is no way to stop it unless the international community decides to put an end to this. Because there is really a manhunt these days. 50 kids have been killed. Refugee camps like Jenin and Balata have been bombed by airplanes and tanks again and again these days. And there is no threat, there is no Hamas military presence, and still the Palestinians are told to leave to Jordan. So those in Gaza are being told to go to Egypt because they will receive tents, schools, again, other refugee camps. And those in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are told to leave to Jordan. Where is the international community? I understand why the Palestinians are pissed off. I understand. I will be pissed off too. I am very pissed off. I'm very frustrated. And yeah, and again, the only thing that we can do is to remember that this is also a watershed moment. This is where we as a people can say, enough, enough. Because we have not been able to stop atrocity crimes and genocides before in Rwanda, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Bosnia. But we have the possibility and the duty and the responsibility to do that now because a genocide might be unfolding and must be stopped. And let's remember, the apartheid in South Africa, another byproduct of settler colonialism, because in a settler colonial regime, apartheid is the natural system it's the structural system by default. Apartheid was not brought down by states who all of a sudden recognized that what South Africa was doing was criminal. It was us, the people, well, not me, not you, but people's workers, trade unions, people of conscience who started mobilizing and reminding over and over to governments that we matter, that we can choose. We choose by deciding what we buy, where we put our money, and there is a lot that is going on now with businesses because pension funds keep on investing on military, bank, settler-related civilian endeavors, and digital surveillance. And both military technologies and weapons and digital surveillance is being tested on the Palestinians and sold abroad. We can still stop it, but we need to be very conscientious, document ourselves, get the facts, the legal qualifications, and act. And every one of us has the capacity to do so. That I remain in shirt in 36 hours. It's very cold here.
Okay, I want you to just keep drinking a little bit more water. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to batch a couple of questions. Like we talked about a couple of questions that I could ask you. I'm going to batch them, and you're going to play a game. You're probably just going to answer one, and then we're going to go to some audience questions. So you can choose the question. Okay. So we can either do the question on what you reported on and what you saw in your reports that you completed over the last 18 months. Or, I have a question as well that I think Julia would have too, because one of the areas of work that Julia looks at is mass incarceration in Aotearoa Māori. And having had every single one of pretty much the men in my family incarcerated in the West Bank, the carceral system, you might want to talk a little bit about that. And the other question, I think you've already answered a little bit, but were you open to talking more about settler colonialism and why you use the word settler colonialism? I think you've already touched on that a bit. So you have a think about that. If you could just squeeze that into 5 minutes, which I have absolute confidence that you can, because she's phenomenal. No, everyone is here to hear this. Everyone is here to hear this. There is no criticism. I just think the audience might maul me on the way out if I don't let them have questions. So, and I think it's very hot in here as well. So yeah.
I'd like to talk about the question of carcerality, because I think I've written 3 reports right now. One on self-determination, which I say, and I wrote that report, I will be very brief. I wrote that report because I wanted to do knock on the, let's say, on the brain, but no, at the door of policymakers who keep on reciting the mantra, two-state solution, doesn't matter the crimes, doesn't matter the violations that take place. Two-state solutions is the solution. Okay, fine, but what does it mean in practice? Because in order to have a state, Palestinians need a territory, and while the Palestinians and the Israelis were left alone in their space negotiating, Israel has kept building colonies, eating up inch after inch of territory that should constitute the land of the independent and sovereign state of Palestine. And I say there is a question of self-determination. Sorry to be boring, but self-determination is a peremptory norm of international law that cannot be violated, ever. It's a fundamental right of all people. And those of us who have it do not appreciate, but people, especially indigenous people who still do not enjoy it, know very well what the right of self-determination is. It's the right to exist as a people, free as a people, economically, culturally, politically, and over a given territory, which is exactly what the right of, what Israel military occupation prevents the Palestinians from doing. And this is why I said this occupation is not simply illegal because it operates outside what is permitted under international law. It's settler colonial because it has become the vehicle to build colonies after colonies. And yeah, and again, and settler colonialism also has an eliminatory intent that is documented and proven in history, and clearly it's operating under our eyes as we speak. The second report I wrote was about arbitrary deprivation of liberty, and it's precisely for what Nadia said. There are almost 1 million Palestinians who have been detained at least once, including children, as young as 12, by the Israeli occupation. Now, in all my reports, I look both at the violations committed by Israel and Palestinian authorities, both the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and the de facto authority, just to make sure I don't just look at Israeli violation. But I'm now talking of how many people Israel has arrested and detained, often without charges, often without trial. But I would like you to understand, because what I did was, together with my splendid special assistant Sarah, I've lost her, but she's here, I suppose, we have looked at thousands of military orders that regulate the life of Palestinians, every minutiae of Palestinian life in the West Bank. East Jerusalem is under the same regime, but through emergency regulations inherited by the British colonial mandate. And the Gaza Strip is also enforced, the blockade is also enforced through military orders. Of course, then there is Hamas ruling, but yeah. And then I've looked at these military orders, and in fact, what they do is not necessarily to prevent crimes or to protect Israeli security, although I would have questioned, why Israel needs to protect its security in occupied territory for 56 years. But however, if you look at the military orders, for example, there is one, my favorite is participating in a gathering of 10 or more people where a political issue is discussed. Find 10 Palestinians, not talking about politics, but without the authorization of the army can lead to 10 years in jail. Living in an area that is declared closed by the military can lead to 7 years in jail. Now you have to think that 60% of the land in the West Bank is directly controlled by Israel. And 1/3 of this is declared a military area, because of course Israeli soldiers need to train somewhere. Why not in Israel? Why not in Israel metropolitan territory is unclear to me. But because Israeli soldiers need to train on occupied territory, this might lead to people in these areas to be kicked out or to be subject to arrest and detention up to 7 years. And the cases are really depressing, but you see that eventually what is crushed is the capacity of Palestinians to live on that land, to exercise fundamental rights and freedoms. And therefore they become a security threat by default, presumed guilty, and often incarcerated, as I said, without charge or trial, and mistreated in Israeli custody. I'm really taken aback when people say, but don't you care about the hostages? Of course I care about the hostages, but I also hear the Palestinians. Has everyone realized that Israel has arrested, often taking them from the quiet of their homes in the middle of the night, 13,000 children. At least once in the West Bank alone over a period of, I think, 10 or 20 years, but the number is incredible. And just to tell you how children are treated, where under detention, they are often taken from their homes on the allegation that they have thrown stones, which lead to 20 years in jail if the stone has been thrown with intent to harm, including a tank, or 10 years in jail if the stone has just been accidentally thrown. And again, these are Israeli military orders. What happens, and this is the calvary, because these kids are taken away, normally amidst much violence against the parents, against the property, by heavily armored soldiers, taken into military jeeps to detention centers, when then a real inferno starts, because most kids are held in solitary confinement during the entire interrogation, people, until they confess what they have done, or until they give names of who are the dangerous people, the security threats in the village. And the security and the solitary confinement on average lasts 16 days, during which the child cannot see a legal counsel or a parent. Most of them are taken outside of the occupied Palestinian territory. This is the reality. And this is just arrest and detention. Because then when you think of the old system, the last report I wrote is about children, and I wrote it after spending my entire summer interviewing over Zoom dozens of kids in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, and trying to tell life under occupation through their own voice, through their own testimonies. And it was heartbreaking, but also uplifting, because it's beautiful to interact with children, isn't it? It's less beautiful to think that most of them are no longer with us, those in Gaza. So, and what these kids say is, their body, their voices, the way they recount their experiences, being it of having a sibling killed, or remaining orphaned, or remaining homeless, or remaining without a school, or trapped in prison somewhere. It's an extraordinarily traumatic experience. In fact, I conclude, together with the Palestinian scholar Shahub Kevorkian, that this is an unchilding experience. And if this can be done to children, imagine the rest. So this is why I said, this is the detention behind bars, but of course they leave jail completely traumatized like all the others, and there is detention beyond bars, because the West Bank, like the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, is a place where Palestinian freedom of movement is extremely constrained by walls and checkpoints and settlements and military bases punctuating the territory, encircling villages and towns. And then imagine 400 kilometers of segregated roads that Palestinians cannot cross, so they can really be trapped in fragments of land. And on top of it, there is the bureaucracy, because there are hundreds of permits that Palestinians need to apply for, to build a house, to get married, to change residency, to open a business, to travel abroad, to travel across the occupied Palestinian territory, to pray. And on top of it, there is digital surveillance. So this is why I say life in the occupied Palestinian territory is life in an open-air prison.